Back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt. Great pleasure to have Professor Eddie Glaude Jr. join me now. He is the author of the brand new bestseller, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its urgent lessons for our own. Hello, Professor. How are you?
I'm good, Hugh. How are you?
Well, I'm different than I was Friday. I read your book. And I got to tell you, uh, Eddie, some books just hit you like a hammer. And this one is one of those for a lot of reasons we'll talk about. But are a lot of people telling you that?
Surprisingly, a lot of folks from across a variety of political spectrums. It's 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 been heartwarming. It's actually blowing me away, Hugh. The response,
Well,
absolutely.
I'll begin with an unusual question. I'll explain it. Have you ever read One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn?
No, I haven't.
Well, I read that when I was 13 or 14, and it changed my worldview because I didn't know anything about the Soviet concentration camps. And there's a scene where Denisovich is laying bricks, which I'll never forget. It's sort of like the scene that you write in Begin Again, March 1968. James Baldwin is introducing Martin Luther King at the Disneyland Anaheim Hotel, where I've been 100 times, and I have never heard of this occasion. I didn't know Marlon Brando and James Baldwin were friends. I didn't know this split had occurred. Would you tell people that anecdote so they will understand via anecdote what exactly Begin Again is?
So yeah, so this is King is trying to organize for the Poor People's Campaign. He's running up against some opposition because he's made a shift to talking about these economic realities and bringing the poor to Washington D.C. Marlon Brando has been a supporter of the movement for a while, and him and Jimmy are really close friends. And he invites King. He puts together this fundraiser and Baldwin was there in California, in LA, working on a script for the Malcolm X film, the Malcolm X script, which eventually failed, but Spike Lee eventually produces. And they begin to narrate. Baldwin is asked to introduce King, and he briefly introduces King, but he begins to narrate what has happened up to this moment, which has brought them to this occasion. And then King comes back, follows him, and he narrates it. And in some ways, Hugh, it's a narration tinged with sadness, because they know that they're standing on the brink of a movement that is collapsing, and they're trying to tell the story in such a way that it can't be absorbed, and to tell the story in such a way that they could how can motivate people to continue to struggle for a better America. It's a profound moment, but this is what we talk about, right? Responsibility is not lost, responsibility is abdicated, and if one refuses abdication, Baldwin says, one begins again.
And if people don't know that story, I was busy yesterday telling a bunch of my friends who grow up in the all white environment of Catholic schools in northeastern Ohio. It's a completely all white environment, and I'm telling people you got to read this because I've never read James Baldwin. I know about him. I've read his essays, but I've never read his novels. I stopped after 120 pages and watched If Beale Street Could Speak, if Beale Street
Uh-huh.
could talk, because I said I can't read a novel at the same time I'm reading this book. Would you tell people about the significance of James Baldwin? Because I assume, although my audience is very diverse and very large, I assume most people don't know James Baldwin, who you referred to just now as Jimmy, very well as all. I didn't even know people referred to him as Jimmy.
Yeah, so Baldwin is a child of immigrants. From his stepfather was from Louisiana, the New Orleans area. His mother from the Eastern Shore. They made their way to the north, to New York City, during the Great Migration. Baldwin was born in Harlem, August 2nd, 1924. He wasn't born in Sugar Hill, Hugh. He's born in the rougher elements of Harlem. So he's not in that area where Langston Hughes and W.B. Du Bois are. He's born in the ghettos in some ways, and went to amazing high school, but actually willed himself into being a writer. First book is Go Tell It on the Mountain, then Notes of a Native Son. These are in the 50s. He leaves I jumped ahead. He leaves the States in 1948 because he's so angry. He feels that the rage in his father is taking root in him. And he leaves and he goes to Paris. Just randomly, he chooses Paris. And there he wills himself into being a writer. finishes the manuscript of Go Tell It on the Mountain and Notes of a Native Son. Eventually publishes Giovanni's Room, one of the first novels, Hugh, about same-sex love. I mean, it's an extraordinary follow-up to Go Tell It on the Mountain, an extraordinarily courageous novel at the time. U.S. publishers refused to publish it, I think, and then publishes, Fire Next Time in 1963, and becomes this extraordinary figure who's interpreting America in the midst of this racial crisis. He goes south. In some ways, to sum up, Hugh, he to me, in terms of democracy and race, is the inheritor of Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's one of our best, most insightful essayists, and one of our most extraordinary artists, in my view.
Well, as I read this, as you introduced me to James Baldwin, I agree. I said this is a guy who can move the needle. In fact, I want my honest sense. It's a very anti-Trump book. I'm not anti-Trump. I'm pro-Trump. But I want people to understand it's the first time I've confronted an anti-Trump argument that I have to respond to. You know, I'm typically dismissive of anti-Trump arguments. I don't think people are informed. They don't challenge what I know. I think they're reflexive. They're often politically motivated. This is from the heart, and it's from an experience that I don't have, and therefore I have to argue back, or I have to think through it and respond. And it's based on three concepts that Eddie Glaude Jr., I want you to explain: the lie, the value gap, and witness. Those are as I am standing here right now, those are the big three. So tell me give the audience a sense of what those are.
So the lie is this idea that America is the shining city on the hill, to use Reagan's kind of reprisal of John Winthrop, right? Of Winthrop model Christian charity, and this idea that black folk are in some ways less human. There's this line that Baldwin says, and I'm paraphrasing. He says that when the country was founded, it was founded by Christians. It was founded principally on the idea of liberty and freedom. But they had to reconcile the fact that they, in some ways, they took these people and made them chattel. And so, in order to justify that they were Christian and that they were founding this country on freedom, they had to say that these people weren't human beings, and they knew that they were. And but to admit that they were human beings was to admit to a crime. So by denying that they were not quite fully human beings, then no crime had been committed. And so Baldwin says in 1964 that lie is at the heart of our present trouble. So the lie about black people, a lie about our capacities, the lie about how we've treated people of color across the world, and the lie that we tell about that history, right, in order to protect our innocence. This keeps us in some ways on that hamster wheel. Now, what's at the heart? What does the lie protect? The lie protects the belief that white people matter more than others. And to the extent to which we value white lives more than we do other lives, black lives in particular, right? We organize our society to reflect that, to reflect the distribution of opportunity, the distribution of advantage and disadvantage. So the value gap is at the heart of the empathy gap, at the heart of the wealth gap. And the lies that we tell about it protect our innocence, right? And what we have to do by way of witness, and you're so right that these are three kind of pillars of the argument, Hugh. The witness is that we have to tell the truth about what we've done. We have to tell the truth about the suffering. As Jimmy says, we have to make the suffering real because we don't want to believe it, because we want to protect our innocence. And part of what I'm trying to do here, Hugh, really quickly, if we can get this out from under our politics, then we can have honest arguments, right? Without attributing bad faith to our interlocutor. Because there's always the undertow that what's driving our political decision making are these racist claims, is the value gap, is this refusal to acknowledge the lie. If we can get this from under our politics, then we can have honest arguments as conservatives, as progressives, about what constitutes the good, what
Eddie,
constitutes the
one of the
best
reasons
pathway.
I think my audience, my center right audience, will love your book is that they are generally among whom you would call the innocent, but I genuinely believe them to be virtuous and to be attached to what you might categorize as the lie. I worked for Ronald Reagan. I worked for the defeat of the Soviet Union. I was driven by anti-communism. But what your narrative is about doesn't take into account the complexity of the people that you would, I think, I don't know. There are categories of people who believe in the innocence of America. There are some who are driven by white supremacy. Hillary Clinton said on this show, we agreed it's less than 500,000 who are actually hardcore white supremacists out of 330 million. But then there are people like me who just don't know your argument, have not lived this experience, and say, look, since 1933, we've been battling for the world. America has saved the world, Eddie Glaude Jr., and Begin Again doesn't give us enough credit for that. And I think you would say, in love, like Jimmy Baldwin did, you don't have a clue. Am I right?
Yes, and the reason, and so there's a kind of, in some ways you don't have a clue, in some ways because it's willful ignorance, right? Because we're so separated in our worlds, we don't want to know what's happening across the tracks, as we would say back home in the South. We don't want, only thing we need to say is, oh, black folk the wealth gap is a result of people not working hard, as if we didn't have a dual labor market, as if we didn't have a dual housing market, as if the New Deal didn't cut black people out, as if there weren't policies, right? Policies that in some ways dictated how people's futures would evidence themselves, right? So my daddy couldn't go to Princeton, and he couldn't go. And my dad is not an old man, right? He grew up in Jim Crow, Mississippi, and he raised me in some ways in light of those experiences. So part of what we have to do is to confront the reality of who we are and what we've done, so that we can imagine ourselves otherwise. See, that's what the book is really about. How can we get off this racial hamster wheel? Well, the first thing we have to do is tell the truth about what we've done and who we really want to be.
No, I don't want to get too far off on the track here, but there are different Americas. And as I read this, I was thinking, what does Eddie think about, for example, the Hewitts get here in 1868, right? We're from Ireland, and we go to work in the mines, and we go to Free State, Ohio. The Northwest Territory was never anything but free soil. My wife's family are Jewish refugees from the Hungarian Revolution who fight on the Union side, and I mean we're free soil Lincoln people. How do you, the South doesn't enter into our world, into our imagination. California and Ohio are just not Alabama and Mississippi, however they good or bad they might be. I think you're the son of the South, and like Stuart Stevens, another friend of mine, I think it overlays the writing, but you are not embittered by that. I think you're aware of that, but do you think I'm trying to let the North off too easily?
Well, this is the irony. Free soil. There's this interesting moment. The Free Soil Party was not anti-abolitionist, so you get the split,
Yes,
right? So
neither
in
was
this in
Lincoln.
this right in this moment where you have free soilers making this argument, which is profound in terms of an understanding and conception of democracy, it's actually cut off from the cruelty and barbarity of slavery, and so that gives you a sense of the divide. So I don't know if, because I think we tend to exceptionalize the South, Hugh. Even in Gunnar Myrdal's The American Dilemma, the argument is that if only, the problem isn't our ideals, it's our practices. If we align our practices with our ideals, then we could actually make manifest the true destiny of American life. And that means that we need to get this region together, the South, when in fact we know that racism, that white supremacy in some ways saturates the country, right? It's not just a Southern problem, right? It's across the country in interesting sorts of ways. And I use the example of the Free Soilers to show, right, that even in that moment in which you have this extraordinary articulation of democratic commitments, it's still not tethered to a critique of what the institution of slavery represents as a distorting
Oh, I got
effect.
that. Yeah, I thought that was actually the challenge is that you're saying to people who are quite proud of their abolitionist heritage, as I am, and of their anti-racist family, as I am, that that's not enough. Yeah, I mean, you're making an argument, and I've often made this conversation with people like Larry Arnn of Hillsdale. Lincoln's second inaugural, you got this, you wrote about this, is prophetic when he says, "Yet if
Yeah.
God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, As was said 3,000 years ago, still it must be said, the judgment of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. That might not mean the end of the Civil War. That might not mean the end of Reconstruction. That might mean 2020. That might be prophetic for hundreds of years. Am I right about you, Eddie?
Yes, absolutely. It requires a reckoning, an honest reckoning, you know? Um,
Okay,
kind
about
of, go ahead, I'm sorry.
in that honest reckoning, you say something interesting about Trump. Trump, you say, has surfaced the key question, which is what about Washington? You're not eager to say anything good about Trump, but you give him credit at one place. You say, the president has said, what about Washington? And that is the key question. You provide an answer, Eddie, because I just don't agree with some of your arguments, but what do you make of the president's or question, what about Washington? I know what your
Right.
answer is,
So,
but tell the audience.
yeah, so, part of what I say is this, that we have to tell the truth, right? That is to say, we can't make them, he wasn't just simply chopping down cherry trees, right? He was a complex figure, just like Jefferson was a complex figure, just like, James Madison was a complex figure. There's a moment when John Adams says to King George, "We will not be your Negroes." At that moment in which he's giving a voice to an idea of freedom is based on an intimate understanding of unfreedom. So what we have to do is get the facts right, tell the story as best we can. Then the second thing we have to understand is the nature of the interpretation. What are we trying to do with those facts? Because telling the story, just telling the facts alone isn't sufficient, right? So those interpretations are put to work for us. So what does it mean to tell the story of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson as these complex figures who founded the nation, but who also were complicit in the underside, the underbelly of the country? Once we tell that story and that interpretation is doing the work, we also need to understand that for some of us who haven't had the choice to reject them, we will. And we will reject them, I think, and Baldwin argues this point. We need to be able to reject them so that we can accept them on our own terms. This is the way in which I read Walt Whitman, Hugh.
Oh,
Um,
yes,
I
yes.
I love Democratic Vista.
Yeah.
It's one of my walking books, right? I could turn around and grab it right now, right? But I understand when you read Leaves of Grass in the early editions of the poem, he's abolitionist. He's anti-slavery. You even have a black character in the poem. But by the time you get to the last edition, he's redacted all of it out because he rejects the idea that black people should be extended
Yeah.
citizenship.
Yeah.
He writes in Brooklyn that we're baboons, in effect. So, how can I come to Whitman on my own terms? I have to be able to reject him in order to accept him. So, we have to deal with Washington and Jefferson, our founders, as complex human beings, not as wholly virtuous or entirely evil. That would make no sense to me.
Now, Eddie, I want to close by making sure people understand James Baldwin. This book is really a meditation on Baldwin and how it's impacted you and America, Black America, and white America, and all of America. Uh, you give a lot of attention to his biography that he leaves and goes to Paris. There was a note in here that I had never known. In December of 1946, his close friend Eugene Worth jumps off the George Washington Bridge. Now, I lost a college roommate at 22. It does change your perspective on life when you lose a close friend at not to suicide, but to an automobile crash. And I was wondering, his whole life is marked by suffering. Does that make him unique among black writers in that he writes more out of the suffering than he does out of his race?
No, he's not unique in that regard. One of the things we have to say is that, Baldwin was a queer black man, and the relationship with Eugene Worth was one that is thought to be that they were in love with each other.
Oh, you
And
didn't mention that. You didn't mention that. Okay, I didn't know that. Okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So there's that they were in love with you and they couldn't pursue it in some way. That's one uh, a potential interpretation of what was going on. But I think something about, let me put it this way, Hugh, because I know we don't have much time. Baldwin says our suffering is our bridge. That if my suffering can lead me to connect with your suffering, then somehow we may be able to connect with each other and relieve each other's pain and grow into being something better, a different kind of human being. This is the heart of the letter he wrote, for example, to Robert Kennedy after John F. Kennedy
Oh, what a
was
letter.
assassinated.
What a
Isn't
letter.
it?
Because they had had a collision. They had been in a huge argument, which I did not know about. Again, I didn't know anything about this.
I came across this little note. It's about this size, right, in the archive, handwritten, right, to Robert Kennedy. And it's a note that basically says, our suffering, it will be our bridge because we're in the same life together. And so
It's interesting.
all the differences, we still can in some ways imagine ourselves being together differently if we're honest with ourselves.
Eddie, I'm going to have you back to talk more about this, but I want to close by asking about you in the book. The harshest review I've ever read is in this book on page 215. Hilton Als is writing about Baldwin's novel, Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone. And he says, I mean, this is hard. Baldwin is found to be has found impersonating a black writer more seductive than being an artist. I mean, that's searing. That's a terrible thing to write about an individual. So Baldwin, new pain, new rejection. What is is there a difference in critical reception for Begin Again in the African American community than there in the white community? Are you getting static from one or the other, or just praise?
It's a combination. I'm still getting criticized over my refusal to support Hillary Clinton. So that I still get hits for that, blamed in part for the election of Donald Trump. But I think the general consensus, Hugh, is that James Baldwin offers us resources to make sense of our current moment, and Begin Again helps us understand that. And because I'm thinking with Jimmy, and particularly the late Jimmy Baldwin, the Baldwin that is grappling with his own despair and disillusionment, he helps me deal with my own despair, and he helps others. So I'm getting the general response across communities has been overwhelming. It's blowing my mind for a little country boy from Mississippi.
Yeah, well, a little country boy from Mississippi with a PhD from Princeton, who is a very accomplished writer. Very quick last question: if someone wants to read Baldwin, where do you tell them to start?
Oh, that's a great question. Buy the Library of America edition of his collected nonfiction writing, and you can begin from the beginning. It'll start with Notes of a Native Son, and you can literally just read him across his career from the beginning to the end.
I think I would tell people to begin with Begin Again, because then you'll have a context and a frame that will fit the American current moment into it. Eddie Glaude Jr., congratulations. What an extraordinary book. And come back and talk more about with me later.
Thank you, Hugh. I really appreciate it, man. Thank
Thank
you
you,
so much.
Professor. Be well. Begin Again is indeed an extraordinary, just a remarkable novel not novel, a remarkable essay, a biography of James Baldwin, intermixed with a series of observations about the American situation in which we find ourselves in on race. You don't have to accept the arguments. I don't. But you've got to accept the history, and you'll walk away with some understanding and some knowledge that you did not have before. You just will, and you're going to change your view. As I said, like One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, change it. It's a hammer. I'll be back tomorrow, America.